This screencast lecture introduces mistake doctrine. These rules determine whether a party's mistaken belief at the time of contracting will justify rescission of both parties' obligations under the contract. Like the excuse doctrines that we've just studied, mistake is about allocating certain risks between the parties. Let's first briefly review excuse and see how mistake fits into the overall scheme of default rules for risk allocation. We can identify two broad doctrinal categories. The rules for mistake focus on what the parties believe about the facts existing at the time of the agreement. In contrast, excuse doctrines tell us what to do about circumstances that make performance more difficult or less valuable for one of the parties. The subcategories of excuse cases include the physical impossibility to perform discussed in Stees against Leonard and Taylor against Caldwell. Examples include the destruction of the music hall in Taylor, or a contract to sell a farmer's own crop that is then destroyed by a flood. We also have cases of impracticability. This is a more modern formulation used in the UCC in the second restatement. It expands slightly on older impossibility cases to encompass situations in which performance is not strictly impossible, but merely much more costly or difficult. Like impossibility, however, this excuse doctrine is still construed quite narrowly. A third category of cases involves frustration of purpose. Perhaps the most famous frustration case is Krell against Henry, in which the owner of a building rented out a room overlooking the parade route for the day of a royal coronation. When the parade was postponed, the court excused performance on the grounds that both parties understood that the entire purpose of the contract was to watch the parade, and that purpose had been frustrated. Notice that performance is still possible. The renter can watch an empty street from an expensive apartment. But performance is pointless because the parade won't be there. It's very important to remember that these are all default rules. The parties can always opt out with an express or implied contract that assigns the risk. Thus, for example, the rental contract in Krell against Henry could easily have provided that the renter understood the risk that the coronation parade might be postponed, and that the duty to pay the rental price would not be excused in the event of a postponement. The rules governing mistake similarly provide default allocations of risk that the parties can override by an express or implied contract. We've frequently used economic arguments about risk allocation and hypothetical bargains to analyze other default rules. We talk of comparative advantage, access to information, and the ability to take precautions to prevent misunderstandings. Let's finish this introduction by seeing where this sort of analysis fits into the formal structure of mistake doctrine. The restatement begins in section 151 by defining mistake as a belief that is not in accord with the facts. The following two sections identify two distinct types of mistake. In section 152, we see that a mutual mistake about a basic assumption that has a material effect on the bargain makes a contract voidable, unless the affected party bears the risk under section 154. In 153, we see a more restrictive standard for unilateral mistakes. A unilateral mistake makes a contract voidable only if the affected party doesn't bear the risk under section 154, and enforcement would be unconscionable, or the other party had reason to know of the mistake, or his fault caused the mistake. Notice that both of these sections point to section 154. The availability of rescission turns on whether the affected party bears the risk under that section. Let's look more closely at the provisions of section 154. Subsection A invites courts to enforce the party's own express or implied risk allocation. Transactional lawyers commonly try to anticipate and provide for many of the common risks that might arise. Subsection B bars relief when a party treats limited knowledge as sufficient, a situation often called conscious ignorance. And finally, subsection C states a general reasonableness test. We've repeatedly found that courts applying a reasonableness standard tend to be receptive to arguments about comparative precaution costs. Thus, these doctrinal rules comfortably accommodate our comparative advantage analysis. It will be easy to give courts a doctrinal hook on which to hang this sort of instrumentalist argument. Thanks for listening.